everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I had a subscriber ask if it's ever really acceptable or a good idea to train to failure on the deadlift. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, do a little bit of crafting, and let's talk about that. Alright, training to failure on the deadlift. Honestly guys, the deadlift is one of those exercises to where it not only can be counterproductive to go to failure, it actually can cause you quite a few problems, but it isn't even necessary to build the most strength, power, muscle mass, and everything else like that from the exercise. And what I mean there is that training to failure on the deadlift is one of those things that can contribute to overtraining. It can contribute to struggling to even do other exercises for the next few days. It can actually lower your overall strength for an entire week from training to failure, and I'll get into that a little more, but it can also cause injuries. People talk about the deadlift sometimes being a dangerous exercise. People get hurt doing the deadlift sometimes. But, really it's one of those exercises that you shouldn't really get hurt on. It is doing things like training to failure that causes you to get hurt on the deadlift. And that's because oftentimes it's fatigue or form breakdown that gets people hurt on the deadlift. It's using bad form, using bad technique. And those things come with fatigue. Well, if you're grinding out reps to failure on the deadlift, what tends to happen? Your form breaks down, your form gets sloppy, and that's generally the case when you start going to failure on a lot of exercises. And there's a lot of exercises that you can train to failure because they're not that dangerous if you get just a little sloppy on them. I mean, let's be honest here, on a barbell row, even a bench press, a lot of those exercises, you can take those to failure without your form getting too bad. A lot of little smaller isolation movements, curls, tricep extensions, even leg extensions, whatever. You can do those exercises to failure, and what usually happens, the weight just comes down. You just can't go anymore. When you've reached muscle failure, you just stop somewhere in the middle of the lift, you strain, and then it comes down. You're done. You just can't lift anymore. With the deadlift, what tends to happen on that last rep or so before failure, your form starts to get bad. It's a big, complicated movement that involves a lot of different small muscle groups in it. People tend to get really, really sloppy on their form when they go to failure on the deadlift because it's not just one or two little joints involved to where the weight just drops and you're done. Sometimes you go to failure, things that you tend to hitch, you tend to grind, you sometimes shimmy and bounce with a weight on your spine, with a heavy weight hanging off of your bicep tendons. It can subject you to just unnormal movement patterns. Shimmying, jerking sometimes happens with a really heavy weight that a lot of times those little smaller tendons and things can't always handle. Sometimes your spine can't handle the jerking. You guys will see guys jerk a little bit. You see them shake and shimmy a little bit. That can compress the spine a little bit with a really heavy weight. That can jerk tendons. That can pull your bicep tendons too hard. You can injure yourself by going to failure on that exercise because you're using a weight that's much, much heavier than a lot of those body parts would have placed upon them in any other exercise. And so when you get jerky and things with it or bouncy in the middle of the movement, when things start to break down, you can tend to injure those things. It can really be a serious problem. And it's one that people have to think about there. All right, and also people tend to start getting sloppy on the resets. They tend to just touch and go and bounce. Well, bouncing off the floor on touch and go is one of those ways that people get hurt on the deadlift. That is one of the ways that people's lower backs get injured, is that bouncing off the floor sometimes. Because again, you don't want this exercise to be ballistic in any way. It's just a really big, heavy movement that puts a lot of load on the spine and everything. It needs to be smooth and clean. Doesn't mean it can't be fast, because it should be fast, but it needs to be smooth and clean. You don't want jerking or bouncing anywhere in an exercise like that. Again, you've got a heavy weight put on a lot of different tendons and delicate things in the body. It needs to be smooth and clean and continuous. Training to failure causes that to break down. And then there's the recovery end of it. You've got to think about it this way also. Your peripheral nervous system gets worked extremely hard on the deadlift. Think about all the different limbs involved and the fact that you're having to lift a weight, a really heavy weight. And I mean, it is a heavy weight. Even if you're doing a 10 rep set, you might be like, well, I mean, I'm only doing 250 pounds or 300 pounds for 10 reps. But you think about that in the grand scheme of things, compared to most of your other lifts, that's a big, heavy weight. You're having to generate speed from the bottom. You're having to pull it from a dead stop explosively. That requires an enormous amount of muscle fiber recruitment. The deadlift uses a lot of muscle fibers to get it started. It has to, because you're pulling it from a dead stop, hence the term deadlift. That requires a very large amount of work to be done by your nervous system. To turn on that many muscle fibers that quickly really puts a lot of strain on your peripheral nervous system. When you push it to the limits and it tries to do a rep that it can't, because it's firing all those muscle fibers and they can't recruit anymore because you've taken them beyond what they're capable of doing, your nervous system tends to give one final push. That's why you see that jerking and that shaking happening a lot of times at the very end when people are getting close to failure right there on that last rep or two, is because their nervous system is firing everything it has. Well, like everything else in your body, your nervous system has to recover. All right, just like your muscles have to recover, your organs have to recover, your bones have to recover from training. Well, so does your nervous system. Well, you've used everything that it had. And the thing is, you've not only used everything it had, but you didn't even recruit any more muscle fibers. It couldn't recruit anymore, so you didn't even get any muscle growth out of taking it to the limit. It stopped stimulating because the muscle fibers are no longer recruiting. They were done. So what ends up happening, it hammers your recovery. And a lot of times when you fail a deadlift rep, a really heavy rep, or you've taken a set to failure, like you tried to do that 7th rep with your 6 rep max and you couldn't lift it, and it just failed and you give out, your nervous system could take days to recover from that. You might find that you try to come in 2 days later and bench press or squat or do a weighted chin up, and you find that you can't do what you were normally capable of doing after that. Meaning that fatigue on your peripheral nervous system can affect everything in your body negatively. All right, it can affect everything in your body negatively. And when that happens, it affects all your lifts. All right, you can't even do chin-ups. You can't even bench press sometimes. Well, what good is it? You've totally destroyed your recovery ability on your other exercises for days, sometimes, worst case, up to a week. It's not worth it. And the truth is, you can get strong on the deadlift without ever grinding a single rep. All right, you can do it through accumulating fatigue, accumulating volume, but as long as you're keeping the reps fast and explosive on the deadlift, you are recruiting an enormous amount of muscle fibers. And you know what? If you need more work on the deadlift, you can do more sets. And here's what I mean. If you come in and you were to take a weight that's 75% of your max, maybe 75%, it could even be less in some cases, and you were to pull 3 reps as fast as you could on the deadlift, it would seem pretty easy. But when you think about that, the muscle fiber recruitment it takes to explode it as fast as you can off the floor, that 75% is hitting upper threshold fibers on a lot of the spots in your body. Well, what happens if you build up and do 10 sets of that? You could probably do 10 sets of that, 10 sets of 3 that way. You would be recruiting upper threshold muscle fibers, building explosiveness, building speed on the deadlift on every single set, right? Because you've lifted it maximally. But from an accumulation, a fatigue accumulation perspective, 10 sets of 3 is 30 reps with a moderately heavy weight, and every single rep you hit the upper threshold powered muscle fibers and all the fibers in between. Honestly, something like that doesn't wear your nervous system down as much as hitting a set to failure. But you think about it from a growth perspective, when you're using a moderately heavy weight and you're doing every rep with perfect form, you're going to get stronger and you're going to be recruiting all those muscle fibers. 30 reps with a moderately heavy weight, well, that's well into the growth zone. All right, that is definitely the sort of workloads that stimulate very significant amounts of hypertrophy. Again, to do 30 reps in one day in one workout with 75% of your max, you're definitely hypertrophy zone training right there. That's just as much work as if you had done 3 sets of 10. All right, that's actually more work than on 3 sets of 10 sometimes, because you're probably using a little more weight than you'd get away with for 3 sets of 10. But every one of those reps ingrained speed, ingrained power, you built up a good amount of fatigue. But you could do something like that that creates a tremendous amount of metabolic fatigue, a tremendous amount of tension on those muscles. You'll get stronger faster, but without going to failure. You know what? You can do something like that and actually find that at the end, you could come back and train the next day. You could train the day after sometimes. It won't hammer your nervous system nearly as much. And you know what? There are plenty of guys who have gone in and been training like that, who come in and hit enormous maxes in competition. All right, You can absolutely get away with training like that. Or you could come in and there's other methods you could use. You could come in and build once or twice a week, 3 times a week maybe, depending on your recovery. You could do 5 rep sets on the deadlift that leave a rep in the tank, meaning you could pick a weight based on your warm-ups that you know you could do 5 reps with. You could probably do 6 or 7 reps with. But if you were to come in and just slowly, consistently build up your peak sets and just do 1 set of 5 with a moderately heavy weight and leave 1 rep, 2 reps in the tank every time, plenty of guys get really big and really strong on their deadlifts doing that with no problems at all. Guys have done this for years, for decades people have trained that way. So you could do it through volume work of accumulating fatigue with things like 10 sets of 3. You can come in and do peak sets of just 1 all-out set of 5 reps. It's not even an all-out set that doesn't go to failure, and get bigger and stronger month after month after month. And the thing is, the deadlift is one of those exercises that because it recruits so many muscle fibers and because it works you so much, it isn't necessary to go to failure to see nearly maximum or maximum results from that exercise. It just isn't necessary. In the case of the deadlift, the actual benefits of going to failure are outweighed by the negatives. You can actually do better on the deadlift by avoiding going to failure, by doing nothing but reps that are fast and powerful and not at your maximum. You actually, most people will do better on the deadlift. They'll get stronger and bigger in the long term by doing it that way than they will by taking stuff to failure. Failure on the deadlift is, for most people, and there are exceptions to the rule, for most people is going to lead to slower recovery, slower gains, and possibly a higher injury rate. So no, I don't recommend people train the deadlift to failure. It just isn't worth it in my opinion. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.